Coming back to some of these common questions, that's the series that I've been doing a bit here in the summer. And some of the common questions that we sometimes get asked, that we sometimes hear when we come in this direction, when we come in the direction of seeking out the Messianic, the Jewish foundations of things. I started out talking about the question of, what made you go to the Sabbath? And I was presenting the biblical case, the New Testament case for why really we never should have left the Sabbath, the Shabbat. And then I addressed, the question that we sometimes hear, and y'all have heard some of it before. Are you trying to be Jewish? Right? Y'all heard that one before. But that one, even in that question, it implies something like there's something wrong with being Jewish in the first place. Next was, why would you want to go back being under the law, under the Torah? Which we talked about in the sense of if you're talking about the curse of the law of sin and death, you're right. We don't want to be under that. We want to be delivered from underneath that aspect of it. That's what Yeshua does for us. But we do want to be under the blessing of the Torah. We do want to be under the protection of the covering of the Torah, because that defines righteousness in God's eyes. It defines what pleases Him. So being under the blessing is a good thing for us. Then I was asking the question about, how is this not, or aren't you not Judaizing? Which usually is thought of in terms of trying to keep the Torah or to impose the Torah and a Jewish way of life on Gentiles, on people who shouldn't have to be doing these kind of things or anything. But we talked about it in the sense of that the Bible, the Scriptures, presents really only two ways of life. There's the way of God, that's defined in the Torah, in the Scriptures, in the Jewish people, the way of holiness. And that's contrasted in the Scriptures to the other way of life that's presented is the ungodly way, the pagan way of life, the way of idolatry. And we talked about it in the terms of those who live by another king's laws. If you follow the laws of a king, then you are under that king's authority. And if you have a different set of laws, then you have a different king. And then in reality, with Scripture, you have a different God. And when we talked about it in terms of sanctification, there's the idea, are you Judaizing? Well, the other option is, you're Gentilizing. Right? And when you're talking about sanctification, it's going to look like, anyway, that we're moving in this direction because we're coming more and more, our lives are becoming more and more in line with His Scripture. And these guys over here are really not going to like being over here. But then the next question would typically come is the charge of legalism. Right? Well, isn't this being legalistic? And most think of anything Jewish is legalism. Keeping the Torah at all, some people will understand that's legalism. And basically anything, this is how people tend to define legalism. Anything more than what I'm already doing as a believer, that's legalism. Anything more than what I'm comfortable with doing, that's legalism. That's how most people define and understand the term. Legalism is anything more than what I'm doing. But that's not how the Scriptures talk about legalism. We looked at these things. The biblical definition of legalism is that it's any law or any Torah other than the rightful king's Torah. And then what goes along with that is making any unauthorized modifications to the king's law or the king's Torah. That is the definition of legalism. If you have another king, then you have somebody else's law. And if you're changing it, if you're modifying it when you're not authorized to do so, that's what legalism is. You're making your own law. And this situation here describes most of Yeshua's conflicts with the Pharisees, with the teachers of the law, because they are trying to set up their own law by modifying, and they'll maybe add additional layers or rules, like he has a conflict about ritual hand washing to the Torah, or they'll subtract things from the Torah where they exempt themselves from elements of the Torah, like we read about with the issue of Korban. Anything that I have is a gift toward the temple, so they feel like they can cut themselves out of any obligation to care for their mother and father. These were changes that they were not authorized to make. This next question that we're talking about, though, this week I'm going to back off of that sense of the legal side of things and address one that's probably a lot more basic. One that won't typically come from a theology. It won't typically come from a pastor or studied person who likes to talk about those kind of things, but typically come from somebody you know. Somebody who is family, somebody who actually loves and cares for you, somebody who probably raised you in church or took you to vacation Bible school when you were young. And it's this question. Well, do you at least still love Jesus? Right? That's pretty basic, isn't it? How many of y'all heard questions or variations of ones like that? Are you at least still talking about Jesus? I've gotten that one. But why would someone even think to ask that kind of question? We all had to start somewhere on this journey to these Messianic, these Jewish types of perspectives. And it typically starts by asking questions, questioning certain practices, challenging certain assumptions or even traditional beliefs and practices. Maybe you started to even withdraw from regular church attendance and the traditional belief. Or anybody start getting those kind of questions even right off the bat when you were starting to back off just a little bit? Maybe you started to withdraw. Maybe you went through a phase like this where everything is pagan. Right? Anybody go through that phase? Everything is Yule when you're part of the church, right? How many can sing that song? I got one. I know if my daughter was in here, she'd be singing this song. Maybe you sent them articles, about the pagan origins of things, or a video. I'm going to show a video here. It's one that is in the vein of the Charlie Brown's Christmas special.
And in Northern Europe, a drunken festival called Yule celebrated the birth of the sun. Families would burn the biggest log they could find and celebrate around evergreen trees to ward off winter depression.
I hate to burst your bubble, Chuck, but this has nothing to do with Christmas. December 25th is still Jesus' birthday.
Actually, no one really knows for certain when Jesus was born. But we do know that when Christianity took hold of Europe in the 5th century, some common folk refused to part with these pagan parties. So Christian leaders gradually transformed these popular traditions into a celebration of Jesus' birth.
Hey, you pagan freaks! My God was probably born today. This party's about Jesus now, okay?
Whatever, dude. It's turned up in this forest.
Inserting Christ into these winter festivals was basically a civic compromise. Make the party about Jesus, and you can keep getting jiggy with it.
Right? Admit it. Anybody send something like that somewhere to somebody? Yes. All right. Probably all went through a phase like that at some point or another. But all those are types of things that your family, they loved, in their past. They shared with you when you were younger for reasons that they may not understand. You started pulling away from those things. You started changing things in your life. You started rejecting them. And how can you still love Jesus if you don't do the things that Christians have done, that your family has been doing for however long? Then they hear that you don't even, maybe not even using and calling him the name Jesus anymore, or very often, but some other name that they never heard of before, a name that they never taught you, a foreign sounding name, and that, Yeshua. You start using that. They hear you express your frustration sometimes, even anger toward what you've been taught. You rejected a belief and a way of life that's been around for generations. You know, if I was still in that kind of position, if I was still in traditional Christianity and my son or my daughter started doing these things, do you think I'd be asking questions? Even to be asking this same question? Sure, I would. Do you still love Jesus? Are you leaving him? Yeah, I'd be asking that question. I don't blame anybody for asking that kind of question. You know, then there's even the other issues and things that they may have seen in you. They may hear your questions. They may hear your challenges. Maybe you've asked about or tried to look up things on the Trinity, on the deity of Christ, the authority of the New Testament, the authority of Paul's writings. Right? You start going down the list of all the things that we start asking about. You've taken up these new holidays that you call feasts, and suddenly those are more important than the ones that you grew up with, and you're willing to do those, but not the old ones. You start talking about strange things that they never felt the need to talk about, things like Constantine, the historical councils. So what do you need to know that stuff for? And then the scariest step of all, they start looking up things on the internet to try to figure out what's happening with you. And then they really freak out, right? Because there's a whole lot of strange directions that looking things up on the internet can take you. Amen? By even reputable people, absolutely. I mean, you start getting into flat earth stuff, Nephilim, polygamy, any number of rabbit trails you can start going down that we've probably known people that have gone down them, if we're honest, right? So again, don't blame them for their concern because it's genuine. And they've also read the scriptures about the end times. When you get to Matthew chapter 24, and this is one of the biggest warnings that we get. Yeshua said, "Be careful that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and will lead many astray." Is the end times going to be marked by deception? Yes. Okay. You look in verse 11. It says, "Many false prophets will arise and lead many astray." Verse 23, "Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Messiah,' or 'There he is,' don't believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will rise up and show great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the chosen," even the elect. So again, they know that deception's coming. They know those passages. What they don't typically realize is that power of deception didn't just start in the last few years. The power of that kind of deception started a long time ago. And they typically assume that they're in the right place already, that they haven't been corrupted or deceived at all, because they assume everything that they're already doing, that's not part of the deception. It's got to be all the new stuff that comes along. That's the only deception. And since you're doing something different, you're doing something relatively new in their mind, then that must mean that you're the one that's being deceived. Right? You see the logic of how that goes? Do you still love Jesus? That's what they want to know. And their fear is not unfounded. Because again, we probably have heard of people, we probably know people that have done exactly that, who have left Jesus entirely. We probably know people who have converted to Judaism, or have spoken to them, or talked to them, or heard of them. The sister of one of my good friends from college happened back in the 90s, back before I'd even heard of any of this stuff. I just thought that was weird. Who would do something like that? Who would even start looking in this direction? And yet it happened to her sister. And guess what she thought when I started telling her some of this stuff? She says, "I've heard all that before. And I saw what it did to my sister." Maybe you know someone who has become in coming this direction that has become so hostile to Christianity, toward people in the church, that they won't even step foot in a building like this. They won't speak a kind word to someone who's still in traditional Christianity, or someone who even will say that, well, none of those people are even saved. Y'all heard any of that? Okay. Do you still love Jesus? Do you love Yeshua? Their fear is not unfounded. We've probably heard of people who have become so Torah focused that they don't even hardly read the New Testament anymore. Again, their concern is legitimate. And they ask these kind of questions, hopefully out of love, and you should reassure that love and that commitment to Yeshua and appreciate that they are actually concerned about you. They really do care. Because if you are coming in this direction and you actually are getting further away from Yeshua, if you actually do start thinking less of Yeshua, you're less interested in Yeshua, you stop reading the New Testament, you're doing it wrong. You are reading the wrong scriptures. You're reading the wrong articles. You're listening to the wrong teachers. And I certainly would not want anyone to ever think that of me. I would never want to give them any reason to think that way of me. If anything, in coming this direction and beginning to look at the Messianic and Jewish foundations of the scriptures of the faith, if anything, my appreciation and understanding about Yeshua has only increased since I've begun studying and learning these things. Anybody else say that? Has your appreciation increased? He is, after all, the Jewish Messiah. The scriptures are constantly prophesying about the coming Messiah. The Torah is constantly prophesying about the coming Messiah, who is going to undo, who is going to fix, who is going to restore humanity from the brokenness of what happened all the way back in the first 3 chapters. That fall that made all of us captives and slaves to sin and death, slaves in Egypt, in essence, to the dominion of darkness. The Exodus that we read about is an event, not just detailing the deliverance of a people at that particular time, but it is setting the pattern of all of our redemption, of what God is doing throughout all of history. Colossians puts it like this. He says, He rescued us from the domain of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son He loves. In Him we have redemption, the release of sins. This is language of the Exodus. Just as Moses was God's instrument to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, out from under the thumb of Pharaoh, so Yeshua is God's instrument to lead both Jews and Gentiles out of the greater kingdom of darkness, out from underneath the rule and authority of Satan, of sin and death. That's who Yeshua is. This is the story that the Father has been telling and building towards from the beginning. Yeshua is the high point of what God has been doing from the very beginning. Our opinion of Him should only increase the more we come to understand this. That reality and that truth must never be shaken and must never be forgotten. And for some strange reason, we actually do have a tendency to forget it. We have a tendency to forget the price that was paid for our salvation. Moses, even in this week's Torah portion, warned the Israelites, that was just one generation removed from the events of the Exodus. He warned them not to forget what they have seen, what they have been a part of. It's when we get comfortable, it's when we get fat and lazy that we begin to forget about things. He says in Deuteronomy chapter 6, he says, watch yourself so that you do not forget Adonai, who brought you out from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery. In one generation, he was telling them, guys, you cannot forget this. You cannot lose track of this. This is going to be the most important thing that you hold on to. And some who have come in this direction have forgotten. or it's become less important. They have forgotten the height from which we have fallen. They have forgotten the depths from which we have been lifted out of the pit. And some, by becoming even fascinated with something good, even by becoming fascinated with the Torah, because it's been wrongly hidden, it's been wrongly denied to us as believers, all these reasons why we don't need to study these kind of things. We actually tend to forget what the Torah is leading us to. Who the Torah is leading us to. How can I elevate the written Torah over the living Torah? When Moses himself wrote in Deuteronomy 18, Adonai your God, he's going to raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brothers. To him you must listen. Moses wrote that. He's saying, guys, there's going to be somebody coming, and he's going to save and deliver the people in a way that reminds you a lot of what I did, what I was a part of. And so how can I put a conflict between the Torah and Yeshua when he raises up the authority of the Torah? Yeshua raises up the authority of the Torah to actually establish his own identity. In John chapter 5, he says this. He's talking to the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. He says, you search the scriptures because you suppose that in them alone, you have eternal life. It's like, yeah, you can study them, but if you're not getting to this conclusion, you're missing the point. He says, it is these that testify about me. If you're really studying Moses, guess who you're going to be able to identify? You're going to be able to identify Yeshua. He goes on in chapter 5, verse 45. He says, do not think that I will accuse you before the Father. The one who accuses you is Moses, in whom you have put your hope. For if you were believing Moses, you would do what? You would believe him. Because Moses wrote about me. But since you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? He is saying Yeshua is elevating the Torah to establish his identity. Moses in the Torah is writing about Yeshua. And if you really did believe Moses' writings, if you really believed Moses, you would believe Yeshua and what he says, not less, but more. You should become more convinced of who he is. You should become more in love with Yeshua, not less. And if you love Yeshua less, again, you're doing it wrong. You're missing the point. You're wasting your time and your effort. Because it's in the Torah that we read even about the what's called the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, in which the father says, he says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains about which I will tell you. Now, what does that language remind you of? Take your son, your only son, whom you love. Does that remind you of any kind of language? What is it, John 3:16? How's that one go again? You got to remind me. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. This is a moment that again pictures and foreshadows what Yeshua was going to do on our behalf, because the Father is not asking Abraham to do anything or to do something with the son of promise that he himself is not willing to do with his. And Abraham knew that. Abraham saw that. Somehow or another, verse 8, Abraham said, God will provide for himself a lamb for a burnt offering, my son. The two of them walked on together. God was going to provide a lamb for a burnt offering. He knew it. The Father was going to provide a son as an offering on that very mountain someday in the future. Verse 13 says, Then Abraham lifted up his eyes, and behold, There was a ram just caught in the thick bushes by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham named that place Adonai Yireh, as it is said today, on the mountain. Adonai will provide. Did God do that? Yes or no? On that mountain, did he do that? Yes. Abraham knew this was coming. And how did Abraham know that this was going to be the case? Again, Yeshua provides the answer. In John chapter 8, he says, "Your father rejoiced to see my day." He saw it and was glad, was thrilled. Abraham was given a vision of the gospel, as Galatians talks about it. He saw the gospel at work. It says, "Then the Judeans said to him, 'You're not even 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham?'" Actually, he didn't say, he wasn't claiming that he saw Abraham, although you could say he did. But it was that Abraham saw him. And Yeshua answered, "Amen, amen, I tell you, before Abraham was, I am." If you love the Torah, if you know who Abraham is, if you study his life and the things that happened to him, then what he said, what Yeshua said right here, is that a big deal? Oh, yes. Did they understand what he was saying? Oh, yes, they did. Because how did they respond to him? Didn't they pick up stones to stone him? Yes. See, this only makes more sense in the larger context of the Jewish foundation of the faith. And without this larger context, if we really don't know much about Abraham, if we haven't been studying him all our life, reading about him every year, without that kind of context, we're really missing the depth of what Yeshua is saying and what he is claiming. So again, our love for him should increase. You know, when you think back to some of the things that they struggle with, it's like, you're not celebrating, maybe you're not celebrating Christmas the same way. We may not be celebrating his birth the same way that we grew up doing. Not with the trees, not with the presents, or even in December. Oh man, heaven forbid. But there is no real command from God to do any of those things anyway, right? But should we recognize, is it a good idea to recognize and celebrate his coming? Yeah, it is. Those new holidays that our friends and family don't really understand, don't they really point to him? In terms of Yeshua's birthday, rather than a made-up day in December, most of us fall into two primary camps, that Yeshua would be born at Passover, or the other option, I tend to favor, is that of Tabernacles. We look at, I kind of tend to think that John kind of gives us a hint of things. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. He pitched his tent among us. We looked upon his glory, the glory of the one and only from the Father, full of grace and truth. But it's not that we don't think that he came. It's not that we don't recognize that he was born. It's not even that we don't celebrate it. We just do it at a different time and in a different way. See, those feasts reveal the Messiah and what the Messiah is going to do. The feasts are the most powerful gospel tract anyone has ever developed. How many of y'all have ever gone out there and passed out tracts and tried to do evangelism and all those other kind of things? The feasts are God's gospel tract for us to share who he is and what he is doing. The first four, the spring feasts, were fulfilled to the day. Dying on Passover as our sinless, unleavened sacrifice, raised on first fruits. Again, that's how Paul shares the gospel to even these pagan Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he says, "Get rid of the old chametz, so that you may be a new batch, just as you are unleavened. For Messiah, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." He's talking mostly to Gentiles. Right? a very pagan city. That sentence wouldn't mean anything if he hadn't been telling them and teaching them about the feast. If they didn't know what unleavened bread was all about, if they didn't know what Passover was about, if they had never done or seen any of those things, then he's speaking way over their heads in a context, in a reference that they know nothing about. But he is using those things of the feasts and the holidays and the feast days to tell them about Yeshua, to build that solid foundation of faith. And he encourages them to celebrate it. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast, not with the old chametz, the chametz of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread, the matzah of sincerity and truth. Again, that encouragement, that exhortation means nothing to those Gentiles if they've never been a part of those celebrations. And he goes on to talk about the feast. Corinthians is really, you've got to look at Corinthians through the eyes of the feast, because he talks about the resurrection in terms of the feast in chapter 15. But now Messiah has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. What day was he raised on? The Feast of First Fruits. That's what made that day important. He says, for since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead has also come through a man. What do these Gentiles have to have heard about in order to know what this means? They've had to have been reading through Genesis, right? It says, for as in Adam all die. Well, who is he? Well, he's got to be teaching them from that. So also in Messiah will all be made alive, but each in its own order. There is a specific order to things. God doesn't do things just haphazardly. He does things in order. Messiah, the first fruits. Then at his coming, those who belong to Messiah. Paul is using the feasts to elevate Yeshua. Those statements, for me anyway, didn't mean nearly as much as they do now. Before I had an understanding, before I had an interest in the feast, this stuff didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. Anybody else? Because I had never kept unleavened bread. I had never really participated in Passover. I had no clue about first fruits. I mean, that's just not even on the radar. I understand who Yeshua is and what he came to do even more. And when you think about Yeshua's return, his second coming, that makes a whole lot more sense in light of the fall feasts. Passages that so many try to study, and try to figure out all the little details should be understood in light of the fall feast. How can you really understand what Paul is referencing when he talks about the trumpet call of God if you have no interest or knowledge or awareness of what the Feast of Trumpets is, Yom Teruah? 1 Thessalonians, he says, for the Lord himself shall come down from heaven with a commanding shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the blast of God's shofar, and the dead in Messiah will rise first. The idea that it is called the day of the awakening blast. Who knew? It says, then we who are alive, who are left behind, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we shall always be with the Lord. Celebrating the feast, tabernacles, a picture of the kingdom. All these things, and so much more, right? Because isn't this just scratching the surface? So much more in our examination, in our turn, in our look toward the Jewish foundations of the faith, again, should only increase our opinion, increase our understanding, increase our love for Yeshua. And I could go on and on and on. I could talk about the Word being made flesh. I could talk about the Ancient of Days. I could talk about the Son of Man, the Alpha and the Omega, or the Aleph and the Tav. The Father shares his glory with Yeshua even though he's not supposed to share his glory with another, because all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. I understand more that he's not just another human being. I understand more that he didn't just appear to be human. I understand more that he didn't become the Messiah, at his baptism, which is all things that church history has struggled with for a long time. Instead, we understand even more what Hebrews talks about. He says, in these last days, he has spoken to us through his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he created the universe. That verse alone, you need to have a good understanding of the foundation of the faith in Genesis, in the Torah. It says, this Son is the radiance of his glory. Again, that's language that's right there out of Genesis. And the imprint of his being, upholding all things by his powerful word, when he had made purification for our sins. If we never read or study Leviticus, do we know anything about purification? Not really. He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. He is the high priest in the order of Melchizedek. He is leading and directing worship in the heavenly tabernacle. In this way, he is the priest of the covenant of redemption, the Abrahamic covenant. In many ways, Yeshua, we understand, is the one who walked in the garden. He's the one who provided the bread and wine to Abraham. He is the one who danced, I would say danced, not wrestled with Jacob, who gave the orders to Joshua from Jericho, who stood in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He must increase. We must love Yeshua even more. And again, if you don't, if in coming this direction, your interest in him is waning, you're doing it wrong. Your friends, your family, they may not understand the changes in you. They may not understand the perspectives that you have. They may even give you a hard time about it from now and then. But you should never give them reason to doubt your love and your commitment to Yeshua. If that describes you, that you've given them reason for them to doubt, then there needs to be a time of repentance. Because that should never be said of any of us. We need to turn to him, turn to Yeshua, and renew our loyalty to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's what we need to do if that describes us. Because keeping his commandments, keeping the Torah, means nothing if it's not done with love for him as the foundation. John chapter 14 puts it this way: if you love me, you'll do what? Now, we're encouraged to keep his commandments, but we're encouraged to keep his commandments from what perspective? Our love for him. He says, he who has my commandments and keeps them is actually the one who loves me. He who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and reveal myself to him. He goes on. Says, Yeshua answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word. My Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our dwelling, our tabernacle, with him. And he who does not love me does not keep my words. And the word you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me. So is there going to be any conflict between Yeshua's words and the Father's words? No. And see, this is the challenge even for those that are asking you questions and challenging you and who say, question your love for Yeshua. Do they really love him? Because if they loved him, what would they be doing? Wouldn't they be keeping his commandments? Would they not also then start pursuing his Torah? That in no way conflicts Yeshua's teachings, his commands, in no way conflicts with the Father's teachings and commands. Because otherwise he couldn't be the sinless Messiah. See, it's as our love for him increases, should actually increase our move in this direction so that we may walk as he walked. It says, now we know that we have come to know him by this, that we keep his commandments. And the one who says, I've come to know him and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. You say you love him, but do you really? But whoever keeps his word, in him, the love of God is truly made perfect, mature, complete. And we know that we are in him by this: whoever claims to abide in him must walk just as he walked. So again, this is a question that we may get from time to time. Do you still love Jesus? And the answer to that question should be yes, even more. Even more. And it should be a doorway, an opportunity to ask them, do you really love him? Because they're not asking you that question because they don't like you. They're asking that question because they do. They're asking that question because they care. They ask that question because they're concerned. And they don't understand maybe what you're doing or what's changing, or are you rejecting them, right? That's sometimes how it may feel, but it's not about that. It's about pursuing him and pursuing his ways and obeying God rather even than the traditions of men. Because we've got a lot of things built up over the years that really don't have a place or a foundation or a command in the scriptures, aren't there? There's a lot of things in there that we do, have been doing. And it's a desire, as we've been singing about, we got to understand that the way is being prepared. That the paths are being made straight, that the things that are the hazards and the high places and all the other things are being leveled. All in preparation for the coming of the King. It's because when he comes and he sits on his throne in power and glory, what's the standard by which we're going to live? What's the standard by which he is going to rule his kingdom? Isn't it his commands? So again, if we love him, if we are coming in this direction, then our love for him must increase and not decrease. Amen?